Welcome to the Youth Employment Working Group discussion on the Y20 communique. By way of introduction, we're the Youth Employment Working Group at the European Student Think Tank, an international organisation that involves young people in the European policymaking process and promotes the values of the European Union and human rights through various events and publications. The Working Group on Youth Employment seeks to discuss the position of young people in the working world today. Our theme for this year focuses on unemployment in a European context, as members look to reevaluate the Youth Guarantee, the impact of climate change on youth employment and workplace mobility. Our members here today include Zofia Borowczyk, Tom Etheridge, and Tiffany Thomason. Today, we'll be discussing with Zofia her experience as a Y20 delegate. Zofia will run us through how the Y20 works. We'll be discussing the selection process for delegates with her, as well as the negotiation process and how the Y20 itself unfolded. Linked to this video is the Y20 communique, an outcome of the discussions held. Zofia is now going to run us through a small presentation on the Y20.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. So my name is Zofia. I'm a final year student at the University of Bristol, where I study social policy. I'm a social assistant for the Vice Marshal of the Polish Senate, and I'm this year's Y20 delegate for the European Union, and I was specifically working on the youth employment track. So firstly, let's start with what is the Y20 actually. So the Y20 is a youth conference that brings together youth leaders to argue, discuss, and exchange ideas with the aim of reaching a joint agreement regarding the G20 presidency. So it's an officially recognized conference, basically involving all G20 member states, where youth is selected to participate in the discussion. So each year, the conference is held in the country of the G20 summit. So this year, it was held in Indonesia. In July, we were in Jakarta and Bandung for around a week. And basically, we had a bit of sightseeing. We had fruitful discussions until 3 a.m. in the morning, very interesting, which ended in the publication of the Y20 communique, which was later handed over to the heads of state and the governments of the all G20 members. Basically, it is officially recognized. However, I must kind of point out that, each country recognizes the youth communique very differently. Some take it more into account, some take it less into account. So it's very dependent on actually which country is representing, what head of states is attending. So it very much depends. So this year we had 4 delegates. So the first one was Jonas, who was a delegate for the digital transformation track. I was the delegate for youth employment, Natalia was the delegate for diversity and inclusion, and Tom was the delegate for sustainable and livable planet. So we were all selected via the Young European Leadership NGO, and we all participated in the summit. That's basically a really short introduction of what the Y20 is, and we can take you forward to the next steps. Yeah, so as I've mentioned, I was working in the youth employment track, and we're just going to discuss the few points now.
Great. So thank you so much for this presentation. We had a few questions on the selection process for delegates before we sort of hop into the youth employment side of things and what you focused on in particular. So I think the first question that I think most of our listeners or watchers will have will be to know sort of how the delegates are selected and how you actually first got involved with this.
Yeah, of course. So it very much depends, again, to which country you're representing. So, for example, there were countries such as Saudi Arabia, Russia, or even, I think it was even South Korea, Mexico, for example, that were kind of more officially selected by the government. So they were very much closely linked with the current government, with the current policies. So although they were kind of attending as youth, they also had some sort of attachment to the current government of their countries, which, it can lead different ways. Some were more focused on basically spreading what the current government is saying. Some did not have that much influence. It very much depends. But most countries, most delegations were selected by youth NGOs that are officially recognized to pick those delegates. So specifically for the European Union, I was selected by the Young European Leadership NGO. So it's basically a European NGO that deals with all EU matters, we send delegates to different conferences such as COP, the Y7, the Y20, and different other small summits throughout the year. Yeah, and we were selected by the organization. I'm personally part of the organization as well as an officer, so I deal with delegations specifically. Yeah, and the application process is pretty simple. You do have an application form that you have to submit in order to get to the further stage of the application process, and you're later invited to the interview. And after that, delegates are selected and kind of officially nominated to be part of the Y20. So it's not too hard, I'd say. The application process isn't too hard, although it is pretty competitive. You've got a lot of applicants who are really amazing people and have done a lot of amazing things. But it's also very important to point out that it's really important to try, because you never know. And it's always a very good, fun experience. So I definitely recommend it to anyone that wants to is thinking about participating.
Thanks, Zofia, for your interesting answer. And maybe if I can follow up with another question, would be what kind of background in terms of education, in trainings, or even interest, would you say that most of your peers delegates have?
I'd say, well, it very much depends, because we don't always want, it's not always like the same specific person that we want to attract to attend the Y20. And there I'm talking as the YEL officer. But I feel like all of the delegates this year, so me, Jonas, Natalia, and Tom, I feel like we all had like a very diverse background in terms of we all kind of finished like good university, so we had that academic knowledge. But besides that, we had things that we're doing outside of university. So we all had internships. Well, for example, Tom is already a bit older. He's already working for the the World Economic Forum, for example. So he's had really good background within sustainability. But all of us kind of like volunteered with different NGOs. We had a lot of research that we were doing previously. So I feel like the background is it's very broad, but basically I'd really recommend that you kind of focus in the track that you want to attend and kind of gain knowledge in those specific ideas, just to kind of like show why you're like the most qualified person for the job, and also why like that your knowledge will actually be able to contribute to the negotiations, not only for the European Union, but also for different organizations later, when we're kind of like meeting other delegations, other workers of the Commission, the Parliament. It's good to have that background knowledge. It always comes in handy. So I'd really recommend kind of making sure that you've got a clear path, and kind of that your interest is not only for like, for example, one activity. You've kind of like build that on further.
Brilliant. I mean, I think you touched upon negotiation being a key skill that I think that you all shared. So I guess this brings on to another question, which is, so keeping in mind all these negotiations that you're doing, what are really the sort of aims and desired outcomes of, first off, the kind of the Y20, but also within the G20, and how do the young people involved view the process, and how do the older people involved view the process?
Well, idealistically, we would love for our youth communique to be, well, it is officially recognized, but we would love countries, member states to, and the EU, which is not a country, but we would love for the G20 members to actually like take into account what we're actually saying, and not only on like a level, okay, like this is what you think, but we're not going to take it into account. We would actually love to see some of our policies involved in actually like future negotiations, not even on the G20 level, but for example, if member states decide like, okay, this is an amazing policy proposal, we're going to take it down a notch and we're going to try and implement it within our respective member state, then I feel like that's what we're aiming towards. It's also part of like, advocacy as well, so activism as well. So although like, we would love those policies to be implemented, it's also about kind of like raising awareness and kind of like discussing it on like a wider scale. And it gives us the opportunity, as we were personally invited to meet with some workers from the European Commission. So we met, for example, for my respective track, we met with the cabinet of Commissioner Schmidt, who is the Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. So that was actually very, very insightful, because we did talk about mostly about youth employment. And I managed to raise some key points that are most important to youth, such as, for example, unpaid internships, and kind of the difficulty for different socioeconomic groups to kind of gain experience, gain the education they want, and later gain the job that they actually want to get into. So, advocacy is one part. We would love for the policies to be later implemented. However, it works in different ways. Well, actually, currently, I feel like a few days ago, the European Parliament announced that they will be taking into account the youth test that the European youth is kind of advocating for, as well as the ban of unpaid internships. So they're actually going to be starting to discuss about it. So, those are the actions that we're hoping for. It would be amazing if that would be considered for all tracks, for all policies, but it kind of works out two ways. But I feel like this year we've had a good, at least for the youth employment track, we've had a good amount of kind of advocacy done, and kind of we were able to put the policies forward, and they were actually, I feel like, acknowledged by workers of the European institutions.
And Sophia, if I may, in this sense, do you have any specific case, any specific country that endorsed the communique very actively? Do you have any examples to give us?
I feel like it's kind of hard for me to say, in terms of I'm not representing those countries, so I don't want to speak for others, but I know that I think, I'm not sure, but there were a few countries that the delegations were more officially recognized, and later they also were more officially invited to discuss the communique. So that those things happen. However, I don't want to speak out for certain countries, as I'm not representing them, so it's kind of hard to say. Our European organizations, so the European Commission, within the youth employment kind of track, they were able to kind of, I feel like, understand what we were trying to achieve, and hopefully they will actually be able to put the policies forward. But they seemed very, very open to the negotiations. So it very much depends. It's kind of hard to say.
No, fantastic. I mean, it definitely sounds like it's been taken on board, at least, and very much considered. I mean, this kind of leads on to another question that I think that we had, which was how much of the negotiations that actually happened prior to the actual event? Could you kind of talk us through the negotiation process?
Yeah, so most of the negotiations are done before. So there are pre-summits that we can attend, where different delegations kind of show off what their policy proposals are, basically. And later, the draft is kind of written before the actual summit. However, during the summit, it's different when you meet people in person and different when you meet people online. So when we were sat during the summit within one room, it was definitely easier to negotiate, and you could kind of walk up to someone, discuss one certain policy. I know we did this with the unpaid internship policy specifically, because that was not included in the communique pre-summit. Only during the summit we kind of discussed it with other European countries, and later we kind of proposed this policy, which got passed. It was put in the communique. But it's always easier to negotiate in person. However, in order to attend I feel like it was 4 summits. In order to attend more summits, pre-summits before the actual summit in Indonesia, it's very hard to travel. So that was done on a hybrid level. So I'd say bulk of the work is done before. However, I feel like the work during the summit is actually the most important, because you can, when you're in person, and it's always nicer to actually speak to someone that you see sitting in front of you. So I'd say the summit is the most important part.
I was wondering about now. I was thinking of a question from the top of my mind. And what were the issues that you discussed in general, overall? What were the main issues that you discussed?
Well, I would have to talk about the entire communique, But we had 6 focus groups that we discussed. So the first one was social safety net coverage. The second one was skills development. Then it was school to work transition, social entrepreneurship system, financing and incentives, and fair and sustainable employment. I feel like the ones that were most important to like Europeans was firstly the policy on unpaid internships. I feel like that was very big, and that did get a lot of attention later as well. And kind of the general idea of kind of supporting people, youth specifically, to get the education and employment they want, no matter the socioeconomic background they actually come from, because that is a big problem. I can definitely say that it's a big problem for example, youth in Poland, where, for example, if you're living in a big city, it's much easier for you to get good employment. It's much easier for you to attend like the school that you want to attend. Whereas, for example, if you're living a bit outside of the big cities, it's much harder. So kind of making sure that no matter what background you have, no matter like how much financing, how much support from your parents you actually have, you can actually get into the employment that you're passionate about, and you're not forced into the labor that you don't want to go into, even though you're passionate about something else.
And did you sense, so you mentioned, for instance, this is quite important for the European side. Did you get a sense that there were other issues that sort of were faced by other countries that were a surprise to you, for instance? Or, I mean, how did the kind of negotiations evolve, considering the sort of large diversity of, the different countries represented?
I feel like within our track, it was all very, not unanimous, but I feel like we all kind of had like a really good understanding of each other. Like there were not that many controversies. Although there were some, it wasn't, us fighting all the time. I wouldn't even call it fighting. There were some issues that like we did not all agree on. I know if, for example, the unpaid internships policy, specifically European countries, European delegations, we wanted to actually use the phrase unpaid internships. However, banning unpaid internships. However, it wasn't the case for other countries. So, I feel like that was a big issue. And also, in the last section, so in the section of fair and sustainable employment, we did discuss a lot about kind of about like high working standards, and kind of like making sure that you're not discriminated, for example, based on your sex, your religion, etc. So we did discuss a lot about those issues. However, I feel like those were the two most important ones that I feel like we had a lot of discussions about. But I feel like the rest, we were all kind of very understanding of each other and our and what we wanted to achieve.
Maybe Zofia, may I ask you to run us through the main key recommendations? Since we have it in front of us, maybe you can comment a bit on the other ones that you haven't commented on now.
Yeah, so I'd say the first one is the supporting vulnerable groups with social protection and benefits to allow youth to be able to financially support themselves, as well as gain valuable skills at their range of skill, their stages of their employment. So it's making sure that you're all again, what I've said before, that you're all able to access the employment that you want, and you're able to support yourself. I feel like that was very important. The second one, so it's the second one on the right, which specifically talks about NEET. It's basically a phrase used within the European Union a lot. So it's not in education, employment, or training. It basically talks about providing a range of skills, extracurricular trainings, programs, training sessions for all youth, which again, they can be accessed no matter one's financial status or place of residence. So this is also what I've said before, that basing it on my knowledge of how the country of Poland works is, again, if you're from a big city, it's so much easier for you. And even if you don't have the finances necessary, it's still easier if you're based in a big city. Whereas if you were based outside, it's just so much easier for you to get good education, which it's usually the case that basically you can get better education within a big city. And later that kind of leads to like employment as well, as there's just like way more opportunities. And, you know, students, youth from kind of other places of residence who live outside of big capital cities, it's not as easy for them to kind of like, you know, travel and gain experience. So I feel like that was the general idea throughout the communique. We did talk about like career support for youth, so such as internships, alternatives for the university path, and moreover, phasing out unpaid internships, specifically focusing here on the public sector, as those are very highly, those happen the most often, but, you know, in general, also providing stipends for students within all work spheres. That was very important. We did talk about kind of like social entrepreneurship, so basically about youth who want to start a business and who want to, you know, start a business which will later bring employment to fellow youth. But, you know, making sure that since we are youth, like we've literally just gotten out of the education system. I'm personally still in the education system, so I would love someone to actually like, you know, if I were to start a business, I would love to have someone who's showing me how to do it, showing me how I can actually like start a good profitable business, and like show me not only like give me financial support, but also give me the knowledge that they have, that they've managed to acquire during their entrepreneurship. We did talk a bit about tax reductions. However, I'm not going to lie, that's not my my most knowledgeable field. I'm not as expert in those. I'm more into like training, for example, and education. But we did talk a bit about tax reductions and benefits for first-time entrepreneurships, again, to kind of like stimulate youth to start their own businesses. And the last part was about in general about like upholding high working standards. That was very important to us. So making sure that discrimination does not happen. And I feel like a very big win for us was actually including the phrases of, you know, such as sex, gender, religion, all of those words were actually included in the communique. So I feel like that was very important, considering as like we've got different countries attending. So we have countries that may not recognize the discrimination that we as Europeans recognize. So I feel like that was very important. Another kind of like small point about you know, currently COP has finished very recently, COP27 in Egypt. So we did discuss a little bit about kind of ensuring sustainable employment and making sure that, you know, people who were previously employed within the fossil fuel industry, they are able to kind of transition into sustainable employment, and they're not kind of like left out there to dry, but they've actually got the support they need to change their kind of path and get employment in the sector that is going to be more sustainable and will develop in the future. So I feel like those were kind of like the general policies like that were most important, I'd say, to myself and in general to European youth. But, you know, it's a long document, so you can have a fill-in read and actually read through each policy. And I feel like that's going to give you a more in-depth idea of what has actually been agreed upon.
I mean, and given that, I mean, are there any areas in particular that you're most proud of, or that you thought actually we're not entirely sure if we'll be able to agree on this? And are there any areas that you would like to see get the most attention? So is there anything particularly sort of new about this that you think actually this is the area that people should pursue the most?
I wouldn't say like there's one specific thing, but I feel like what I've kind of been thinking about and like discussing is kind of the relation between education and employment, that employment does not only start at the minute like you finish your education, so you finish either high school or whatever kind of like path you go to. Employment doesn't start when you finish education. It starts before. It starts whilst you're in education. It starts like even like way before, because it actually relates a lot to like where you come from, who your parents are, how much money you have, what kind of opportunities you're able to gain. So I feel like that kind of understanding that employment is not only whilst you're working, it's kind of like leading up to that. So kind of like getting, you know, the skills you need, getting like, you know, programs that you can attend, and making sure that you're able to like do those things whilst also being supported, and that it doesn't exclude people because of their socioeconomic difference. And And that does happen very, very often, very sadly. So I feel like that kind of understanding should get a lot more attention, that, employment doesn't only start when you start working. It starts way before, even like before your education. It's kind of like a path that you build up throughout your entire year up to the point where you actually start working. It's so much beyond that. So I feel like that understanding should get a lot more attention. Plus unpaid internships, again, a very big topic within the EU. You can go and sign the European Youth Forum campaign. Currently is amazing. They're actually advocating to ban all unpaid internships. So please go and support if you if you fancy. But that's a very big topic currently. So I feel like those kind of two points, I feel like they were the most important. I feel like they should get way more traction that they're currently getting.
Follow-up question on this, Zofia. How do you see these recommendations that you made here? How do you see this applying to national context? Because I guess there should be some from country to country differences. So maybe if I take two examples, the one closer to you, Poland and the UK, for instance, how do you see this recommendation applying to this context?
Well, again, it's hard for me to speak about the UK, since even though I study there, I'm not that very familiar with what like their more in-depth policies that they currently have. But I feel like with, for example, unpaid internships. So I did attend like a conference in the Polish Senate last week, and we did present the Y20 communique there. And we did talk a lot about unpaid internships. And the senator that was there, he actually pointed out that although he agrees fully with what we're trying to like argue, and he gets that unpaid internships are very exclusive and they only kind of attract a certain group of people, it's very hard to implement it. And he kind of said that it should first be implemented on like a European scale and then later brought down to member states, for example, because it's just with different governments, for example, within Europe, for example, the Polish government is very conservative. So I feel like it's not a topic that they would want to focus on. However, if the EU would actually act upon the matter, then maybe that would somehow kind of pressure Poland to do the same. But you never know. So it can kind of go both ways. I cannot, like, it's hard for me to say. I'm not a politician. So although I'd love to have a bigger influence in the Polish government and the Polish parliament, it just doesn't happen. So I hope they take it into account, but it's kind of hard to speculate, I'd say.
It's really interesting what you mentioned about the fact that actually there has to be an example, and that sort of starts off, and that's where Poland would take its cue from, as opposed to the other way around. Which I guess sort of brings me on to the next point, which is, I mean, sort of going forward, where do you see the community as having its impact? What's next for this sort of advocacy work done by young people?
Well, I definitely hope it continues, and I feel like it will continue throughout the next G20, so the next Youth 20 as well. We still don't really know what tracks will be happening during the next Y20. However, for example, for the Y7 is also going to be happening in April. The applications are currently like literally about to close. And the tracks that are represented within the Y7, they're actually very similar to what was represented within the Y20. So for example, we've got a track, of course, on sustainability and environment. We've got a track on digital transformation. Then we've got a different track than we had in the Y20, which is the global health one. And we are going to be having the economy and future of work track, which is very closely related to youth employment as well. So I very much hope that kind of we're going to be more linked with the future delegations, for example, and also with kind of the policies that we as the Y20 delegates try to achieve this year, and like we've managed to put in the communique, and hopefully that future delegations were actually like taken into consideration when creating their own. So I feel like that's going to be really important, and I feel like that's a way to start and kind of like make that clear link. But it's also about like individuals actually advocating for what we've kind of managed to agree on. I'm sure like I will continue, because this is like a really like an amazing topic that I feel like it's not spoken about as much. especially the kind of like link between education and employment, kind of how that's actually like they're interconnected. So I feel like a lot of future activist work is in the scope, but we'll see where it leads, I guess.
And Sophia, I have again a particular question. Why do you think that the youth employment isn't that much discussed? So, what do you think it is the main problem with it?
I don't know why, to be honest. Like, I mean, it's just like not a topic that people discuss. In terms of like, for example, if I think about how the Polish politics is currently shaped, it's like we only kind of like see what people are arguing about. We don't really see what people are agreeing on, even though, for example, I completely disagree with our conservative government, as I'm more of like a left-wing person, that those are like my beliefs. But there are still things that like we could agree on. Like it's just like, for example, during the summit, like I wasn't like able to discuss policy recommendations with countries such as Russia or Saudi Arabia. And even though like I may not agree with the government's policies fully, there are things that we actually agree on. And I feel like youth employment is like one of those things where like it's not that it's very agreeable, but like when we, for example, talk about trainings for youth from different backgrounds, like who would not agree on that? Like I feel like that's common sense that it should work this way, that all youth should be included. But I feel like it's just like we don't talk about it as much. There are topics, for example, in the Polish government currently, about like abortion, women's rights, sex education. You've got climate change, energy. All of those things are like highly spoken about, but because I feel like they gain a lot of tension also because they're very controversial for the discussion between right and left. Whereas I feel like youth employment, although it does have some controversies, like I'm pretty sure some politicians within Europe in general would not agree on unpaid internships, but there are people who would agree on it. However, also like another like factor, like another thing to factor in is like it's such a broad topic. As I've mentioned, youth employment, but like education is like all interconnected. So you would literally have to do like a full education reform and kind of discuss how that links with employment. So I feel like it's a big topic for one, and two, I feel like it's not that controversial, at least on the Polish scale, that people don't actually talk about it, which they should because it's so important, but they don't. So I think we just have to like discuss it more within youth, because I feel like we do have a voice, and just kind of like make sure that we kind of pass on what we actually believe in. Yeah, and hopefully that's going to have an impact in the future.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for your answer. I completely agree with you, to be honest. But then I will do just a final question. What are your plans for the future? What would you like to work on further?
Well, I feel like this issue is like not finished, so I feel like I would just continue working on what we've kind of agreed upon during the Y20. So the unpaid internships for sure, kind of the sustainable employment aspect within the green economy transition, specifically focusing on the European Green Deal and how that's gonna affect employment. I feel like also kind of like building on the link between education and employment. So I feel like those are kind of like the topics, the aspects that I would want to advocate and like discuss more within, for example, ESC and like different advocacy groups. But what's to come? Definitely coming back to continental Europe. That's the plan.
Well, thank you so much for talking us through all of these issues and your role in helping solve them, I guess. And thank you again for your time. So just a brief note before we close this, that anything that Zofia has mentioned throughout this, the communique, etc., will be linked below the video. So do read up on this, and do look out for the work that Zofia will be undertaking alongside the rest of the team as part of the Youth Employment Working Group in the EST.
Thank you so much.